Nobody expected the judge to be the one leaving in handcuffs when Jessica Black mocked Pam Bondi in open court. It looked like Bondi was finished until she flipped the entire courtroom on its head with one move that shocked everyone. The federal district court in downtown Manhattan hummed with anticipation. Reporters jostled for prime positions, their equipment creating a tangle of cables across the polished floor the gallery had filled to capacity an hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin. With spectators whispering excitedly about the showdown they were about to witness, Judge Jessica Black swept into the courtroom precisely at 9 a.m., her black robes billowing behind her with dramatic flair. At 52, she possessed both the gravitas of her 15 years on the bench and the calculated charisma that had made her a darling of legal commentators. The gavel struck with authority and silence fell immediately. The United States versus Brighton Development Corporation, announced the clerk as all rose for the opening of the day's proceedings. Across the courtroom, Pam Bondi arranged her documents with methodical precision. As a special prosecutor appointed to the high-profile corruption case, Bondi had become the subject of intense scrutiny. Conservative media praised her tenacity, liberal outlets questioned her qualifications, yet Bondi herself remained unreadable. Her blonde hair perfectly styled, her navy suit impeccable. The prosecution may proceed with opening statements, Judge Black declared, her tone crisp and professional, though the slight curl of her lip did not go unnoticed by the more observant spectators. Bondi rose, nodding respectfully toward the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor." In the press section, reporters leaned forward eagerly. The New York Times journalist had already drafted half his article, certain that Judge Black, known for her progressive leanings and intolerance for conservative legal approaches, would systematically dismantle Bondi's arguments. A cable news legal analyst whispered to her producer that they should ensure they captured every facial expression from the bench. The tension in the room was almost tactile. Brighton Development Corporation stood accused of massive fraud and environmental violations, but the subtext of the case had become increasingly political. Judge Black had been appointed during a Democratic administration. Bondi's reputation was tied to Republican causes. The legal arguments would be dissected through partisan lenses regardless of their merit. As Bondi began her opening statement, Judge Black's eyes narrowed slightly. She tapped her pen against her notepad, a subtle but distinct gesture of impatience. The babe who had worked with Black for 7 years recognized the signs. The judge was preparing to make an example of someone, and Bondi appeared to be today's target. In the defendant's section, the Brighton executives exchanged knowing glances. Their lead counsel had assured them that Judge Black's well-documented disdain for Bondi would work in their favor. They had chosen their venue carefully, pulling strings to ensure their case landed on Black's docket. Bondi seemed oblivious to the currents of expectation and prejudgment swirling around her. She laid out her initial points with calm confidence, her voice steady and measured. If she sensed the hostility emanating from the bench, she gave no indication. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Everyone present, from the veteran court reporters to the youngest law clerks, knew they were witnessing more than just another federal case. This was to be a clash of personalities, of political alignments, of competing visions of justice itself. Judge Black adjusted her glasses, her mouth set in a thin line. She had already interrupted 3 attorneys this week. The gallery held its collective breath, waiting for the first judicial thunderbolt to strike. Bondi's presentation, no one least of all Judge Jessica Black herself, could have predicted how this day would end. 20 minutes into Pam Bondi's opening statement, Judge Black cleared her throat loudly. "Miss Bondi," she interrupted, not bothering to mask her contempt. Perhaps in Florida courts this kind of circular reasoning is acceptable, but federal proceedings require a somewhat higher standard of argumentative coherence. A ripple of surprised laughter spread through the gallery. Bondi paused, her finger marking her place in her notes. "Your Honor, I was explaining the pattern of financial..." Yes, Judge Black waved dismissively. "You were explaining what any first-year law student might recognize as basic accounting fraud. I'm wondering when you'll address the actual complexities of this case." The Brighton executives exchanged pleased glances. Their attorneys scribbled notes, furiously, clearly delighted by the judge's open hostility toward the prosecution. Bondi drew a deep breath. "If I may continue, Your Honor, the evidence will show that these weren't merely accounting irregularities, but a systematic..." "Miss Bondi," Judge Black interrupted again, removing her glasses for dramatic effect, "this court has handled corporate malfeasance cases that would make your experience as Florida's Attorney General seem like supervising a lemonade stand. Perhaps we could move past the remedial explanation this time." The laughter was louder. A young law student whispered to her companion, "Black is absolutely eviscerating her." Journalists typed frantically, capturing every bar. Bondi stood perfectly still, absorbing the mockery without visible reaction. When she spoke again, her voice remained even. Your Honor, with respect, the complexity lies not in the individual transactions, but in how they were concealed through a network of shell companies specifically designed to, let me guess, Judge Black interjected, leaning forward, designed to evade regulatory oversight. How groundbreaking! She glanced at the gallery with a knowing smile that invited them to join in her derision. Ms. Bondi, we're all familiar with the basic concept of corporate veils. This court's time is valuable, a defense attorney chuckled audibly. Judge Black did nothing to discourage the disrespectful atmosphere that was rapidly developing. Bondi closed her folder. Your Honor, I believe the evidence itself will demonstrate the significance of these structures. If I may proceed with calling our first witness. By all means. Judge Black sighed theatrically. Though I hope your questioning will be more substantive then your opening. As Bondi called the SEC forensic accountant to the stand, Judge Black made a show of checking her watch. When the witness described finding irregularities in Brighton's offshore accounts, the judge interrupted again for the benefit of Ms. Bondi, who may not be familiar with sophisticated financial instruments. Judge Black commented, perhaps you could explain these concepts in more accessible terms. The witness looked uncomfortable at being enlisted in the judge's mockery throughout the questioning. Judge Black peppered the proceedings with similar comments, each one undermining Bondi's authority and competence. Yet something remarkable was happening with each interruption. With each public humiliation, Bondi's demeanor seemed to grow more focused. Rather than flustered, she adjusted her approach methodically, anticipating the judge's interruptions and working around them with practiced skill. In the press gallery, a veteran legal correspondent from the Washington Post frowned slightly. Having covered dozens of Bondi's cases, he recognized a particular quality in her composure, not the stiff resistance of someone weathering criticism, but the patient calculation of someone waiting for precisely the right moment to strike. 3 hours into the proceedings, the dynamic in the courtroom shifted. Bondi approached the bench with a thick legal volume in hand. Your Honor, before we continue with witness testimony, I'd like to address a procedural matter concerning evidence admissibility. Judge Black made no effort to hide her impatience. Make it quick, Miss Bondi. I'm citing Kellerman v. United States 1987. Bondi began, her finger moving to a specific passage, a relatively obscure decision from the Second Circuit, but particularly relevant here. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Kellerman, that case concerned maritime jurisdiction. Miss Bondi, hardly relevant to corporate fraud. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Bondi's lips. With respect, Your Honor, while Kellerman began as a maritime case, the appellate decision established important precedent regarding evidence obtained through regulatory inspections conducted without proper notification. Precisely the situation with the SEC's examination of Brighton's overseas operations. Judge Black, for the first time that day, she appeared momentarily unsure. Furthermore, Bondi continued, opening a second book in Hamilton Trust versus Commissioner 2002. The court held that regulatory powers, when exercised beyond statutory limitations, cannot serve as the foundation for subsequent prosecution. He would direct the court's attention to page 347, paragraph 3. The defense attorneys were no longer smiling. One frantically searched through his own materials, a look of concern crossing his face. I am well versed in Hamilton Trust, Miss Bondi. Judge Black responded, though she accepted the offered volume and studied the passage. Then the court is also familiar with Judge Thornton's concurring opinion, which specifically addresses the issue of jurisdictional overreach in cases involving multinational corporate structures. Bondi's question was delivered with perfect professional courtesy, but the challenge within it was unmistakable. A law clerk behind Judge Black was furiously typing on his laptop. He slid a note toward the judge, whose eyes widened slightly as she read it. In light of these precedents, Bondi pressed on, I would like to submit that the evidence obtained from Brighton's Singapore subsidiary falls squarely within the Hamilton Trust restriction. Unless she paused meaningfully, unless the court has already made a determination regarding the application of the multinational corporate veil doctrine as outlined in Westmoreland International 2018. A quiet gasp came from the gallery where several legal scholars sat. One professor from Columbia Law whispered to his colleague, She's right, Black can't have it both ways on the jurisdictional question. Judge Black's earlier smugness had vanished. Miss Bondi, are you suggesting that this court has ruled inconsistently on this doctrine? Not at all, Your Honor, Bondi replied smoothly. I'm merely establishing the proper framework for admissibility before we proceed further. In fact, your own ruling in United States versus De La Cruz last year seemed to support the narrower interpretation of regulatory authority. The courtroom had grown utterly silent. The judge's face flushed slightly as she realized Bondi had thoroughly researched her prior decisions and found a potential contradiction. I will take these citations under advisement, Judge Black said stiffly. We'll take a 30 in recess." As the judge departed, urgent whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. The defense team huddled in concerned conversation. Journalists, who had come expecting to witness Bondi's humiliation, were hastily revising their narratives. Bondi calmly returned to the prosecution table, arranging her materials with the same methodical precision she had shown at the beginning of the day, but now observers noted a subtle change in how others regarded her. The dismissive smirks had been replaced by cautious respect. The tide was turning when Judge Black returned to the courtroom after the recess. The atmosphere had noticeably shifted. Her usual commanding presence seemed slightly diminished as she shuffled her papers with uncharacteristic hesitation. The gallery, previously entertained by her mockery of Bondi, now watched with heightened attention, sensing that the power dynamic had begun to change. "The court has reviewed the precedents cited by Ms. Bondi," Judge Black announced, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. "While I maintain that they are not entirely on point, I will allow the prosecution to continue with the understanding that admissibility questions remain under review." Bondi rose, nodding respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." The prosecution calls Raymond Wires, former chief financial officer of Brighton Development's Asia-Pacific Division, as the witness was sworn in. Bondi methodically arranged her evidence binders. The defense team's lead counsel leaned forward, suddenly alert to the dangerous precision in Bondi's movements. Gone was any trace of the supposedly outmatched prosecutor they had expected to face. "Mr. Winters," Bondi began, "could you explain your role in establishing the financial reporting structure between Brighton's Singapore office and its Delaware headquarters?" Judge Black interrupted almost immediately. "Miss Bondi, we've already established the corporate structure. Let's not waste time retreading ground." "With respect, Your Honor," Bondi replied calmly. This line of questioning directly addresses the jurisdictional issues raised during our discussion of Hamilton Trust. "If I may continue." The judge's lips tightened, but she nodded curtly as Weiners began describing complex international transactions. Judge Black's frustration became increasingly apparent. Twice she attempted to redirect Bondi's questioning, only to have Bondi respectfully but firmly tie her inquiries back to the previously cited legal precedents. When the judge tried to exclude a set of documents as irrelevant, Bondi immediately referenced Federal Rule of Evidence 836, along with an obscure exception established in a Second Circuit case directly applicable to their current venue. "Your Honor is certainly familiar with Judge Moskowitz's ruling in Brennan versus Global Financial?" Bondi asked, her tone innocent but her eyes sharp with challenge. A clerk approached the bench and discreetly passed Judge Black a folded note. As she read it, her complexion paled slightly. Whatever the message contained, it clearly unsettled her. In the gallery, spectators began whispering. A court sketch artist captured Judge Black's increasingly troubled expression. Defense attorneys exchanged concerned glances as they watched their expected advantage evaporate with each passing minute. "Miss Bondi," Judge Black said, her voice now strained, "this court is well aware of the Brennan decision. Please continue with your witness." Bondi nodded and turned back to Weiners. "Mr. Winters, did you ever receive direct communication from Judge Black regarding the structure of Brighton's offshore accounts prior to the commencement of this case?" A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. "Objection." The defense team leapt to their feet. Judge Black's gavel slammed down with such force that its head cracked. "Miss Bond, that question is entirely inappropriate and borders on contempt." Bondi remained unruffled. "Your Honor, I have documentation suggesting communications between your chambers and Brighton Development executives dating back 18 months, which would constitute ex parte contact relevant to this proceeding." The judge's face flushed deep red. "Those allegations are completely unfounded. I will not allow in that case." "Your Honor," Bondi interrupted smoothly, "would you be willing to submit to a review of your communications by the Chief Judge of this district? If my information is incorrect, I would face sanctions for making false claims against the court." The tension in the courtroom was now palpable. A senior FBI agent seated in the back row quietly spoke into his phone, his eyes never leaving Judge Black's increasingly flustered face. This court will take another recess." Judge Black managed, her voice unsteady. "1 hour, my chambers now," she hissed to her clerks as she rose, nearly knocking over her water glass in her haste to exit the courtroom. As the judge disappeared through the door behind the bench, the courtroom erupted in astonished murmurs. Bondi calmly returned to her table, ignoring the stunned stares directed her way. No one noticed the 2 U.S. Marshals who quietly entered through a side door, positioning themselves near the judge's chambers. The hour-long recess stretched to 90 minutes. Then 2 hours in the courtroom. Speculation ran rampant. Journalists huddled in corners, making urgent calls to their editors. The defense team for Brighton Development had gone from confident to ashen-faced, several of them making hasty exits, only to return looking even more distressed when the doors finally opened. It wasn't Judge Black who entered, but Chief Judge Robert Montgomery, the senior judicial officer for the district. His grave expression silenced the room instantly. "This court will come to order." The clerk announced, though his voice wavered slightly. Chief Judge Montgomery took his position at the bench. Due to extraordinary circumstances, I will be presiding over these proceedings for the remainder of the day. Judge Black is temporarily relieved of her duties pending an investigation. The gallery erupted in shocked whispers. Montgomery struck the gavel, once restoring order. Miss Bondi, I understand you have evidence you wish to submit to this court. Bondi rose, her composure unwavering despite the dramatic turn of events. Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution submits as evidence this sealed packet of communications between Judge Jessica Black and 3 executives of Brighton Development Corporation dated between March of last year and 2 weeks ago. She approached the bench handing over a thick manila envelope secured with evidence tape. Behind her, a federal agent carried a digital forensics case. These communications were discovered during our investigation into Brighton's internal messaging system. Bondi continued. They reveal not only exact discussions about this case but also evidence of financial transactions between an offshore account linked to Judge Black and a shell company controlled by Brighton Development. Gas and exclamations filled the courtroom. A woman in the gallery stood up and rushed out, nearly tripping in her haste. Chief Judge Montgomery broke the seal on the envelope and began reviewing its contents, his expression growing darker with each page he examined. After several tense minutes, he looked up. Miss Bondi, when did you become aware of these communications? 3 days ago, Your Honor. We immediately notified the FBI and the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. Given the sensitive nature of the allegations, we followed protocol for judicial misconduct investigations, which required confidentiality until evidence could be properly secured. The defense team for Brighton was now in chaos, with attorneys frantically whispering and passing notes. Their lead counsel finally stood. Your Honor, we request an immediate recess to review this new evidence and its implications for our client's request. Denied. Montgomery replied firmly, this court is now primarily concerned with the integrity of these proceedings. He turned to Bondi. Please continue with your presentation of evidence. Bondi nodded to the federal agent, who connected a laptop to the courtroom's display system. Email threads appeared on screen showing correspondence between Judge Black and Brighton's CFO discussing the case in explicit detail, including how certain rulings would be handled. Next came banking records showing transfers of over $2.3 million to an account in the Cayman Islands, followed by documents linking that account to a trust benefiting Judge Black's family. The prosecutors handling the case against Brighton now appeared as shocked as everyone else. Clearly Bondi had kept this investigation compartmentalized, revealing it, even to her own team, only when absolutely necessary. As you can see, Your Honor, Bondi continued, her voice steady and clinical. These communications constitute clear violations of judicial ethics and potentially criminal behavior under 18 U.S.C. Section 201, the federal bribery statute. Chief Judge Montgomery nodded grimly. I've seen enough to take immediate action. He turned to his clerk. Please contact the U.S. Marshal Service. Judge Black is not to leave the building. A prosecutor from Bondi's team approached the bench with additional documents. Your Honor, we have prepared a formal complaint and arrest warrant request based on this evidence. Montgomery reviewed the papers, his expression grave. The evidence appears substantial and concerning enough to merit immediate action. He signed the document and handed it to the clerk. Throughout this extraordinary turn of events, Pam Bondi maintained her professional demeanor, though keen observers might have noticed the slight satisfaction in her eyes as years of being underestimated culminated in this moment of vindication in Judge Black's chambers. Oblivious to what was transpiring in her courtroom, the judge was frantically deleting emails from her government computer. The courtroom had transformed into a hub of urgent activity. Chief Judge Montgomery had cleared all spectators except for essential personnel, but the hallways outside buzzed with reporters and legal observers trying to piece together what was happening behind the closed doors. Inside, a team from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had arrived with digital forensics equipment. Technicians in blue windbreakers methodically documented and secured electronic devices from Judge Black's chambers while investigators cross-referenced Bondi's evidence against federal databases in real time. The timestamps match perfectly, a forensic analyst reported, comparing the communication logs with data on her screen. These messages were exchanged during critical periods of case management, including when defense motions were being considered. Chief Judge Montgomery, now seated at a conference table rather than the bench, nodded grimly. And the financial transactions, a Treasury Department official who had been summoned from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, consulted his secured tablet. We've confirmed 6 transfers totaling $2.6 $7 million, slightly more than Miss Bondi's initial estimate. The money moved through 3 jurisdictions before reaching the Cayman account. Bondi stood quietly near the prosecution table, occasionally conferring with the lead FBI agent, but otherwise allowing the investigation to unfold without interference. The meticulous case she had built spoke for itself through the glass partition separating the courtroom from the judge's private corridor. They could see Judge Black in animated conversation with her staff. Her arms gesticulated wildly as she spoke, her face contorted with panic. A court clerk exited her chambers and approached Chief Judge Montgomery, his expression troubled. "Sir, Judge Black is requesting to speak with you privately. She says there's been a misunderstanding." Montgomery exchanged glances with the lead federal prosecutor. "Not appropriate at this time." Informed Judge Black that she should contact her attorney immediately. "She's already called the district attorney," the clerk reported nervously. Bondi raised an eyebrow. "The district attorney has no jurisdiction here. This is a federal matter." The investigation continued with methodical precision. Each piece of evidence Bondi had gathered was scrutinized, verified, and added to the growing case against Judge Black. What emerged was a pattern of corruption spanning at least 4 major cases, with the Brighton development matter being only the most recent. "We've accessed the electronic docket management system," an FBI cybersecurity specialist announced. "There's evidence of selective reassignment of cases to Judge Black's calendar, cases specifically involving corporations with connections to that same Cayman Islands account." Chief Judge Montgomery rubbed his temples. "This is worse than I imagined. The damage to the court's reputation will be extensive." "There's more," said a Justice Department attorney who had been reviewing emails recovered from the server backups. "We found communication suggesting Judge Black deliberately delayed rulings in the Westerman antitrust case last year, delays that coincided with significant stock trades benefiting Brighton subsidiaries." Inside her chambers, Judge Black was visibly crumbling under pressure. Through the glass they could see her pacing frantically, occasionally glancing toward the courtroom with increasing desperation. A senior clerk emerged from her office, approached the investigation team, and spoke quietly to the lead agent. "Judge Black is attempting to access the secure judicial network from her personal device," he reported. "She's trying to modify docket entries from previous cases." The agent nodded to his technical team, locked down her access credentials immediately. Outside in the hallway, the murmurs grew louder as word spread that something unprecedented was occurring within the courthouse. Several Brighton executives, who had been present for the morning session, were seen hurriedly leaving the building, pursued by reporters shouting questions about their relationship with Judge Black. "We've completed our preliminary review," the lead agent finally announced, turning to Chief Judge Montgomery. "Based on the evidence Miss Bondi provided and our initial corroboration, we have more than sufficient probable cause for an arrest." Montgomery nodded solemnly. "Then proceed as the law requires. No one, especially not a federal judge, stands above justice." As 2 U.S. Marshals moved toward Judge Black's chambers, Bondi gathered her materials, her expression revealing nothing of what she must have felt witnessing the fall of a judge who had so publicly ridiculed her just hours before. Chapter 7: The Arrest Order. The courtroom doors opened with a heavy finality as 2 U.S. Marshals and an FBI agent entered Judge Black's chambers. The remaining spectators in the hallway pressed against the barriers, straining to glimpse the unfolding drama. Inside the main courtroom, Chief Judge Montgomery stood solemnly. "This court will reconvene," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of institutional responsibility. The doors to the chambers swung open. Judge Jessica Black emerged, flanked by law enforcement officers. Her face, previously animated with condescension, now appeared ashen. Her hands trembled visibly as she clutched a designer handbag to her chest like a shield. "Your Honor," the lead marshal addressed Chief Judge Montgomery, not the woman whose title had effectively been stripped away moments earlier. "We've secured the subject's personal electronic devices, as instructed." Black's eyes darted frantically around the courtroom, lingering momentarily on Pam Bondi, who stood quietly at the prosecution table, the recognition in her gaze that Bondi had orchestrated this moment, not through vindictiveness but through meticulous legal work, seemed to break something fundamental in her composure. "This is absurd," Black finally managed, her voice cracking. "I've served on this bench for 15 years. You can't possibly—" Jessica Black, the FBI agent, interrupted, reading formally from an arrest warrant. "You are under arrest for violations of Title 18 United States Code in 21, accepting bribes as a public official, Title United States Code Section 1956 money laundering, and Title 18 United States Code Section 1512 obstruction of justice." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Several junior attorneys who had appeared before Judge Black looked physically ill as they watched their mentor's dramatic fall. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent continued, reciting the Miranda warnings as the marshal produced handcuffs. "This is outrageous. You can't put those on me in my own courtroom." Black protested, backing away. Chief Judge Montgomery spoke, his voice heavy. "This is no longer your courtroom, Miss Black." The sound of metal clasping around her wrists echoed in the silent chamber. Judge Black, now simply Defendant Black, stood in shocked disbelief as the cold reality of her situation finally settled upon her. The black robes that had symbolized her authority now seemed merely theatrical costume. Counsel should be prepared to appear before the magistrate judge within the hour. The marshal announced to the room at large. Though his words were clearly directed at Black, the defendant will be processed according to standard protocol. As they led her toward the side exit reserved for judicial personnel, Black twisted to look back at Bondi. "You planned this," she hissed, anger briefly overcoming her shock. "You set me. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video."